My daughter called it justice. My old army buddy called it poetry. I just called it Tuesday. We were sitting at a corner table at Hannigan's Bar, the kind of place where the bourbon is cheap and the lighting is forgiving, and my buddy Steve was laughing so hard he had to set down his glass before he spilled it. He'd driven 4 hours from Columbus just to hear the whole story in person, and now that I'd finished telling it, he looked at me the way men look at each other when they've seen something rare, something that almost never happens in this world, the moment when the right person gets exactly what they deserve. So, let me get this straight, he said, wiping his eyes. He fired you. In the room. With the client sitting right there. With the client sitting right there, I confirmed. Steve shook his head slowly, and he had no idea, not a clue. He raised his glass. I raised mine. And for a long moment, neither of us said anything, because some things don't need words. My name is Daniel Marsh. I'm 57 years old. I spent 8 years in the United States Army, 2 of them deployed, before I came home to Cincinnati and spent the next 20 years building something I was proud of. I want to tell you exactly what happened, not the version my former employer told the press, and not the cleaned-up version either, the real version, because there's a lesson buried in it, and it's not the one you think. I joined Meridian Health Solutions in 2004 as a senior software engineer. Back then, it was a small operation, 12 employees, 1 floor of a rented office building on Reading Road, and a CEO named Robert Cole, who had the handshake of a man who meant what he said. I liked Robert. He was old school. He believed in showing up early, staying late, and paying people what they were worth. In those early years, he and I would sometimes work side by side until 10 or 11 at night, eating takeout over our keyboards, arguing about architecture decisions and laughing about it afterward. Meridian's business was healthcare data infrastructure. We built the systems that hospitals and medical groups use to manage patient records, billing data, insurance claims, the invisible plumbing behind the walls of American healthcare. It's not glamorous work. Nobody writes magazine articles about it, but it matters enormously. And doing it wrong has consequences that go well beyond inconvenience. Over 2 decades, I rose from senior engineer to lead architect to, eventually, chief technology officer. Along the way, I designed and built the core of what we called the ClearPath system, a proprietary data processing platform that handled the translation and routing of patient information between incompatible systems. Different hospitals use different software. Different insurance companies use different formats. ClearPath was the bridge that made them talk to each other cleanly, securely, and without losing critical data in the translation. It took me 4 years to build the first version. I spent the next 12 refining it. In 2019, I filed for and was granted a patent on the core algorithm at the heart of ClearPath. The patent was filed in my name, not Meridian's name, mine. This was not an accident, and it was not an oversight. It was a deliberate arrangement that Robert and I had negotiated years earlier, when I had considered leaving for a competitor, and Robert had persuaded me to stay by offering me ownership of my core intellectual work. The licensing agreement between Meridian and me was clear, documented, and reviewed by both our attorneys. Meridian had the right to use ClearPath as long as I was employed there. If that employment ended for any reason, the licensing agreement allowed for a 90-day transition period and then required renegotiation. I want to be clear. I never thought I would need that protection. I expected to retire from Meridian. It was my professional home. Robert was, in many ways, a second family to me after my divorce. I hadn't thought about the patent clause in years. It was paperwork, insurance, the kind of thing you hope you never have to use. Then Robert's son came home from business school. Brandon Cole was 29 years old when Robert named him vice president of operations. He had an MBA from a university I won't name, a wardrobe that cost more than most people's cars, and the unshakable confidence of a man who had never once been wrong about anything, largely because no one in his life had ever told him he was. He was Robert's only child, and Robert, a good man in most respects, had a blind spot the size of Montana when it came to his son. I tried to give Brandon a fair chance. I genuinely did. In his first weeks at Meridian, I sat with him for hours explaining the business, the technology, the client relationships. He listened with the expression of a man enduring a long car ride, politely impatient, waiting for it to be over so he could get where he was going. He asked questions occasionally, but they were the wrong questions, focused on optics and positioning and brand narrative, rather than on the substance of what we actually did. The friction started small. Brandon wanted to redesign the client portal to feel more premium. I explained that our clients were hospital IT departments and insurance administrators, not consumers, and that they cared about reliability and security far more than visual design. He overrode me and commissioned a redesign. The redesign introduced 3 bugs that took my team 2 weeks to fix. Brandon told Robert the bugs were the result of legacy thinking in the engineering department. Then he wanted to cut the security audit budget. I refused. He went to Robert. Robert sided with me on that one, but the conversation left a mark. I could feel the ground shifting beneath me. The deal that eventually changed everything had been in the works for nearly 18 months before Brandon arrived. A company called Vantage Benefits Group, one of the 10 largest health insurance conglomerates in the country, had been in discussions with Meridian about a comprehensive data integration contract. If signed, it would be worth approximately $28 million over 5 years and would position Meridian as Vantage's primary infrastructure partner across 17 states. It was, by a significant margin, the largest deal in the company's history. I had been the lead technical contact on the Vantage account from the beginning. Their team knew me. Their CTO, a careful and methodical woman named Patricia Nguyen, had spent months evaluating ClearPath and asking detailed questions that only I could answer. The relationship between Meridian and Vantage was, in large part, a relationship between Patricia, Nguyen, and me. Brandon decided this was a problem. In the months leading up to the final contract signing, he began inserting himself into the Vantage communications. He would CC himself on emails I sent and then send follow-up messages contradicting or clarifying what I'd written. He scheduled calls with Vantage without telling me. He told Robert that I was territorially blocking the leadership team's access to key client relationships. Robert called me into his office and asked me, gently, to make room for Brandon to grow into the account. I made room. I backed off. I told myself it was temporary. The final presentation was scheduled for a Tuesday in March. Vantage was sending their full executive team Patricia Nguyen, their CEO, their general counsel, and 3 members of their board. We would present the technical implementation plan, walk through the security architecture, answer final questions, and, if everything went well, sign the contract that afternoon. I arrived at the Meridian offices at 7 in the morning to run through the presentation one last time. My team had prepared a detailed technical deck. I had spent the previous weekend personally reviewing every slide, every diagram, every projected timeline. This was the kind of meeting where one wrong answer could unravel 18 months of work, and I did not intend to give any wrong answers. Brandon arrived at 9:30. He walked in looking like he was hosting a television program pressed jacket, hair like a magazine cover, carrying what appeared to be an entirely different set of presentation materials under his arm. He glanced at my deck on the conference room screen, set his jaw in a way I had come to recognize, and said, "We're going with mine." I looked at him. "Brandon, Patricia Nguyen's team has been reviewing our technical documentation for 6 months. They're expecting specific answers to specific questions today. We can't walk in with a completely different presentation." "It's fine," he said. "Mine is better. More executive level. These aren't executives who need to be impressed by visuals. They're technical buyers who need to be reassured by specifics." He looked at me with that particular expression he reserved for moments when I was being tiresome. "Daniel," he said, "I've got this." My team exchanged glances. I took a breath and said nothing more. The Vantage team arrived at 10. Patricia Nguyen greeted me warmly. I introduced her to Brandon, who immediately took the room in a direction I recognized. Polished, confident, and completely disconnected from everything Patricia's team had been asking about for half a year. For 40 minutes, I watched Brandon present a vision of Meridian's future that had very little to do with the specific infrastructure challenges Vantage had been trying to solve. He talked about innovation, ecosystems, and scalable synergies, and showed slides with gradients and icons and almost no technical substance. The Vantage team's expressions shifted from polite attention to carefully concealed concern. Patricia Nguyen raised her hand. "I appreciate the overview," she said, "but we had some specific outstanding questions about the ClearPath integration protocol and the HIPAA compliance architecture. Can we get into those?" Brandon smiled. "Absolutely. Daniel, why don't you take that?" It was the first time in 40 minutes he had acknowledged I was in the room. I spent the next 30 minutes answering every question Patricia's team had, precisely and in detail. The room temperature changed. People leaned forward. Notes were taken. This was what they had come for, and they knew it, and I knew it, and somewhere in his peripheral vision, Brandon knew it too. That was when things went sideways. We broke for lunch. Brandon found me in the hallway by the coffee station and spoke to me in a voice low enough that no one could hear but hard enough that no one would mistake his meaning. You made me look like an idiot in there. I answered their questions, I said. You undermined my presentation. Brandon, don't. He cut me off. I've been patient with you, Daniel. I've tried to bring you along. But you clearly have a problem with authority, and it's a problem my father and I have discussed at length. I looked at him for a long moment. There was nothing useful to say to that, so I said nothing. After lunch, the Vantage team reassembled in the conference room. Robert Cole took a seat at the head of the table. Brandon sat to his left. I sat to Robert's right, where I had sat for 18 months of these conversations. Brandon opened a folder. He placed a single sheet of paper on the table and slid it toward me. I looked down at it. It was a termination letter. My name was at the top. It was signed by Brandon Cole, Vice President of Operations, under a delegated authority clause that I would later learn Robert had quietly added to Brandon's employment agreement 3 weeks earlier. The letter informed me that my employment with Meridian Health Solutions was terminated effective immediately, citing restructuring of leadership responsibilities and misalignment with company direction. I looked up. Brandon was watching me with an expression that I can only describe as triumphant. Across the table, Patricia Nguyen and her colleagues had gone very still. Robert Cole was staring at the table. You're done here, Brandon said quietly. I want to tell you that I felt rage. I want to tell you that I felt devastated. But the honest truth is that I felt something much stranger. Clarity. The kind of calm that comes over you when something you have been half expecting finally arrives, and your body recognizes that the waiting is over. I picked up the letter. I folded it once and placed it in the inside pocket of my jacket. I looked at Patricia Nguyen. She was watching me with an expression I couldn't fully read, something between discomfort and very careful attention. I apologize for the interruption, I said to the Vantage team. Please excuse me. I stood up. I buttoned my jacket. I walked out of the conference room, down the hall, past my office where I picked up my laptop bag, which I had packed that morning, not out of premonition but out of the habit of a man who likes to be ready for things, and out to the parking garage. I drove home. I made coffee. I sat at my kitchen table and opened my laptop. Then I sent an email to my attorney. There is something important I need to explain about the days that followed, because this is the part that most people miss when they hear this story. What happened next was not spontaneous. It was not improvised. It was not luck. It was the result of 20 years of careful, methodical work by a man who understood, at a very deep level, how things are built and therefore how they can stop working. My attorney, a woman named Caroline Delaney, who had represented me since the original patent filing in 2019, read my email and called me within the hour. Tell me exactly what happened, she said. I told her. There was a brief silence. Then she said, You understand what this means for the licensing agreement? I do, I said. The 90-day transition clause activates immediately. I know, which means that as of today, Meridian does not have a clean license to deploy or transfer ClearPath in any new commercial agreement. That's my understanding, I said. I wanted to confirm it with you. That's correct, she said. I'll send a formal notice to their legal department this afternoon. I thanked her. I poured more coffee. I called my daughter, who was 24 and working as a nurse in Portland, and I told her what had happened. She was quiet for a moment and then said, Dad, did you remember about the patent? I remembered about the patent, I said. She laughed. It was a complicated laugh, relieved and sad and something else. Are you okay? I'm okay, I said. And I meant it. What I didn't tell her, what I didn't tell anyone until later, was that I had been mentally prepared for this for almost 4 months. Not because I had planned it, not because I had wanted it, but because Brandon Cole was the kind of person who moves through the world leaving damage behind him, and I had watched his pattern carefully enough to understand that my turn was coming. I had reviewed my patent documentation. I had reread my licensing agreement. I had quietly, without fanfare or drama, made sure that every piece of my intellectual work was organized, documented, and unambiguously mine. I had done this not as revenge. I had done it as housekeeping. Because that is what you do when you have spent 30 years learning that preparation is the only thing that actually protects you. The call from Robert Cole came 48 hours later. I was at my kitchen table again. I had been doing a lot of sitting at my kitchen table when my phone rang and Robert's name appeared on the screen. I let it ring twice. Then I answered. Daniel. His voice was different from any way I had heard it before. Not angry, not authoritative, smaller. I need you to come in. I don't think that's appropriate, Robert, I said. Given the circumstances, please, he said. I went. The conference room was the same room where I had been handed my termination letter 2 days earlier. Robert was sitting at the head of the table. Brandon was there too, but he looked as though the 48 hours had not been kind to him. Patricia Nguyen was not there, but her general counsel was, along with a woman I didn't recognize who turned out to be Vantage's chief compliance officer. Robert asked me to sit down. I sat. The story came out in pieces over the next 20 minutes. After I had left the building on Tuesday, the Vantage team had finished their meeting with a significantly different energy than it had started with. Patricia Nguyen had asked, politely but directly, about the status of the ClearPath licensing given the personnel change. Brandon had assured her that ClearPath was a Meridian product and that nothing would change. Vantage's legal team had then requested, as part of their standard due diligence, the original patent documentation for ClearPath. What they found was my name. Caroline Delaney's letter had arrived at Meridian's legal department that same afternoon, formally notifying them that the licensing agreement had entered its 90-day transition period, and that no new commercial deployments or transfers of ClearPath could be executed without my written consent. Vantage had been informed. Their general counsel had put the contract signing on hold, pending clarification of the IP situation. Patricia Nguyen had told Robert, according to the version I heard later from someone who was in the room, that Vantage could not proceed with a $28 million commitment on technology whose licensing status was unresolved. The deal was on pause. $28 million. On pause. Robert looked at me across the table. He was a proud man. This cost him something. I need to understand what it would take, he said, to resolve this. I looked at him for a moment, then I looked at Brandon, who was staring at a point approximately 6 inches above the table's surface. Robert, I said, I want you to know that I didn't want this. Any of this. I spent 20 years at this company because I believed in what we were building. That didn't change. Robert nodded, but said nothing. What changed, I said, was that I was terminated without cause, without notice, and without negotiation. In front of a client I had spent 18 months cultivating, and then I was handed a piece of paper and told I was done. I understand, Robert said quietly. I don't think you entirely do, I said, because if you did, that wouldn't have happened. Brandon shifted in his chair. I didn't look at him. I laid out what I was willing to consider. I was not interested in returning to Meridian as an employee. That chapter had been closed, and I was not going to ask for it to be reopened. What I was willing to discuss was a revised licensing arrangement, a 3-year exclusive license for ClearPath at a fair market rate, independently appraised, plus a consulting agreement for any work Meridian needed me to perform in connection with the Vantage implementation. I was also willing to discuss a settlement for the termination itself, which my attorney believed constituted a breach of the terms under which I had accepted below-market equity compensation over the years in exchange for IP ownership rights. The number my attorney had advised me to put on the table was not small. Robert listened to all of this without interrupting. The Vantage compliance officer took notes. Brandon's expression had moved through several distinct phases, and had landed somewhere in the vicinity of a man who has just put his hand on a hot stove and is trying to decide whether to acknowledge that it hurts. Robert asked for a week to consult with his legal team. I said that was fine. I drove home. I sat at my kitchen table. I called my daughter. How did it go? She asked. We're in negotiation, I said. Dad, she said, I'm proud of you. I didn't do anything dramatic, I said. I just did what any prepared person would do. That's exactly what I'm proud of, she said. The negotiation took 11 days. Caroline Delaney and Meridian's legal team exchanged 6 rounds of drafts. The final agreement included a 3-year exclusive license for ClearPath at a rate that, over the term of the agreement, would pay me considerably more than the annual bonuses I had been accumulating. It included a consulting arrangement that was entirely on my terms, my hours, my rates, my availability, and it included a settlement payment for the termination that was, as my attorney put it, appropriate to the situation. The Vantage deal closed 3 weeks later, $28 million, Meridian's largest contract in its history. Patricia Nguyen sent me a personal note thanking me for my continued involvement in ensuring a smooth transition. She did not mention Brandon Cole. I framed the note. It's on the wall of my home office, next to a photo of my Army unit taken at Fort Bragg in 1992, and next to a framed copy of the patent certificate issued in my name in 2019. Not because I need to look at them every day, but because they remind me of the things that actually matter. The work you put in before anyone is watching, the relationships you build by being consistently honest, and the documentation you keep current not because you're planning to fight, but because careful people take care of their business. The day after the agreement was signed, I went for a long run along the river trail I'd been using for 20 years. It was early April and cold enough that my breath made small clouds in the air. I thought about Robert Cole, who was a good man who had made a significant mistake and would spend the next few years managing its consequences. I thought about Brandon Cole, who was 29 years old and had done what 29-year-old men sometimes do when they are handed power they haven't earned, and who would have to figure out on his own, as everyone eventually does, that authority borrowed from someone else is not the same thing as authority you built yourself. I did not think about the money, except briefly. The money was significant, and I won't pretend otherwise. But what I thought about, running along that river in the April cold, was my daughter's voice on the phone. "I'm proud of you, Dad," and the weight of that, and what it means to have someone who knows the full story of what you did and why, and still looks at you that way. I thought about the 20 years I had spent showing up early and staying late and caring, genuinely and deeply, about doing the work correctly. About the 4 years it had taken to build the first version of ClearPath. About the 12 more years I had spent making it better, not because anyone was grading me, but because I am the kind of person who cannot put something down until it is right. I thought about the fact that none of what happened was planned. I had not filed the patent in anticipation of being fired. I had not preserved the licensing language as a tactical weapon. I had simply done what careful, experienced professionals do. I had made sure that my work was documented, my agreements were clear, and my intellectual contributions were properly attributed. The fact that it mattered when it mattered was not strategy. It was the natural consequence of 20 years of professional discipline, and that, I think, is the moral of the story. Not the money. Not the look on my former colleague's face in that conference room. Not the fact that the deal ultimately went through on my terms. The moral is simpler and older than any of that. What you build, carefully, cannot be easily taken from you. The people who cut corners in their work, in their contracts, in their relationships, often move faster and look more impressive in the short term. But the ground underneath them is not solid, and the day they need it to hold, it doesn't. Brandon Cole had all the leverage in the world on Tuesday morning. He was the VP of operations of a company about to sign a $28 million contract. He had his father's authority, his MBA confidence, and the ability to end my career with a single sheet of paper. By Thursday afternoon, that leverage was gone, and he hadn't done a single thing differently. The ground had just turned out to be what it was. I had leverage on Tuesday morning too, but I'd had it for years and almost forgotten it was there. The way you sometimes forget about the spare tire in your trunk until the moment you actually need it. Steve drained his glass and set it down on the table at Hannigan's. Outside, the Cincinnati evening was turning cold. The bourbon had been good. "What are you going to do now?" he asked. "Consult," I said. "Patricia Nguyen's team at Vantage has some projects they want to talk to me about. And there's a startup in Nashville working on something interesting in the rural hospital space." "No more full-time?" "Maybe someday," I said. "But for now, I think I'd like to work on my own terms for a while." Steve nodded. He understood. He had spent 22 years in the Army and understood, better than most, what it means to operate with clear lines of authority and what it costs when those lines are drawn badly. "One thing I keep thinking about," he said. "Robert, do you feel bad for him?" I considered the question seriously because it deserved a serious answer. "I feel something for him," I said finally. He built a real company. He made a real mistake. And now he's got to live with both of those things at the same time. That's its own kind of hard. "It is," I agreed. "And his son?" I thought about Brandon Cole at 29, sitting in that conference room, watching the ground fall out from under something he had been certain he controlled. "I hope he learns something," I said. "I genuinely do. He's young enough. There's time." Steve looked at me. "You're a more generous man than I am." "I've just been around long enough," I said, "to know that staying angry is expensive. And I've already spent enough on this." We sat there for a while longer, the way old friends do when the conversation has reached the place where it wanted to go and there is nothing left to prove. The bar was filling up around us. Someone put something on the jukebox. Outside, the city was going about its business. I thought about my daughter in Portland, who was probably finishing a long shift right about now. I thought about the spare bedroom in my house that I had converted into a home office, where the patent certificate hung on the wall and the laptop sat open on the desk, and the next chapter of something was waiting to be written. I thought about the things that hold. The work you do when no one is watching. The agreements you honor not because the law requires it, but because you are the kind of person who honors agreements. The care you put into the foundations that no one sees, because you understand in the way that engineers understand it, in the way that soldiers understand it, that foundations are the only part of a building that actually matters. Those things hold. When everything else gets taken, when the titles disappear and the salary stops, and the termination letter arrives in a conference room in front of a client you spent 18 months earning, those things are still there. In your name. Documented. Yours. The bartender came by, and Steve ordered another round. I covered the tab. It seemed like the right thing to do. Because in the end, it was never really about the money. It was about knowing what you built, knowing it was solid, and having the patience to wait for that to matter. Tyler Pemberton, or Brandon Cole, or whatever his name is, wherever you're watching this, learned that the hard way. I hope, for his sake, that he doesn't have to learn it twice.